What I want to do today is talk about it's more sex than violence, but both things as a sort of act which deal with subjectivity, play with its signification, and really open up what the body is and can be. I do so largely via architecture and thinking about architecture, and but I think it's incredibly helpful in a philosophy conference that the word, I think the word interference has sort of been used quite a bit to talk about the way different disciplines interfere in a way. I think of it as actually something more to do with it's the introduction of that which is both foreign and fertile, highly productive within a particular set and set of thought, sets of logic that make the architecture philosophy relation so active. And it was so this paper is responding to the call of the conference to think about space, control, resistance, and it's also responding to a call that Félix Guattari made in a Nagoya architecture conference presentation that was elaborated upon and became published as a chapter in Machinic Eros, Writing on Japan of 2015, under the title Ecosophical Practices and the Restoration of the Subjective City. Herein, Guattari suggests, quote, birth, death, desire, love, and the relationship of to time, to bodies, to both animate and inanimate forms demand a fresh look, unsullied and receptive, end quote. And though I can't attest to this paper being unsullied, it is definitely going to be receptive. I've tentatively titled the paper The Nonhuman Sex of Architecture, or What It Is to Voyage in Intensity. And part one is an antibody in the body. An angel fell from the proscenium arch of the Théâtre de l'Opéra Comique in Paris in October 1990. It fell early in Min Tanaka's Rite of Spring performance, hitting the stage with a guttural thump. Minutes earlier, I'm going to do sound effects. Minute not for absolutely everything, but just for pointed moments. Minutes earlier, when the audience were assembling and shuffling into their allotted seats in the ornate auditorium, this particular angel was seen occupying the uppermost right hand, stage left, corner of the grand proscenium arch. You could see it if I could press the right button on the pointer to... Oh, it's here. This arch, the proscenium arch, marks the threshold between the auditorium, where people sit, and the stage upon which people perform. The angel at this time soared high upon the arch and was not alone. A second angel hovered on the left, stage right, and together they held the theatre curtain, securing what is often called the fourth wall. These angels were feminine figures, somewhere between demure Art Deco and busty Baroque. Both were golden and draped in a fabric that unfolded into the flourishes of the proscenium and the curtain suspended between them, and in the other direction out from them, across the billowing ceiling and over the four ornately decorated tiers of boxes of the remaining three walls of this voluminous theatre. Odd as it may seem, these angels were well integrated in a building, a neo-Baroque hulk of a building, whose facade itself is composed of at least 8 bodies in stone, and where ceilings were skies, if not heavens. When the angel thumped to the floor early in the performance, Min Tanaka, was the only figure on the darkened stage. The Japanese Buto dancer flared and approached the corpse on wonky legs and broken toes, bent over and moving in a skulking, spider-like, slow-motion scuttle, if the scuttle can be slow. If you haven't seen Buto dance before, it's this particularly poised, muscular, almost sometimes, like immobile type of intensity. So it's not quite like dance as you'd otherwise see. Indeed, you can see Min Tanaka performing at Le Bord in, I think it was 1986, at the invitation of Guattari, and on YouTube you can see there's a small film by François Pin that analyzes this sort of thing. It's a very intense thing to see, an intense thing to perceive. During the opening scene, Tanaka would cavort with the corpse of the angel, and that was no longer poised nor feminine, but now a rather gelatinous, fleshy mass. There is something abjectly visceral about the movements of the fallen angel, otherworldly and yet intimate, and there is something involuntary and spasmodic about the movements of Tanaka, insect-like and poised. But more often than not, both were intensely immobile. And it's this that I want to play with, that which is sort of intense and immobile. Tanaka, that night and over 4 nights, was performing with his Meijuku dance troupe, a reimagining of Igor Stravinsky's Le Sacre de Printemps, tableau de la Russie païenne en 2 parties, that had premiered at the newly opened Art Deco Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in 1913. Stravinsky's original score had been a bounding and thumping cacophony divided into 2 parts, 2 parties, adoration of the earth and then sacrifice. Le Sacre de Printemps told the story of a young maiden who danced herself to death in a folk fertility rite. It sort of sounds like one of the nights of the Deleuze and Guattari Studies Conference. But not last night. Václav Nijinsky's original choreography was a stomping, arrhythmic rollicking that outraged those who'd assumed a classical ballet performance from a company of Russian dancers drawn together by the impresario Serge Diaghilev. 3 kilometers west, and more significantly 2 world wars away, Tanaka gave audiences a performance of barely music, barely dance, barely set, barely bodies. Minoru Noguchi's score for Tanaka was a vibrating hum, the tinnitus of machines, electrical surges, sometimes whirring, sometimes droning, sometimes grinding, and sometimes a banging departure from Stravinsky's score. The set was equally perplexing. The North American sculptor Richard Serra had configured a geometric set of 1 large levered platform in front of projected images which contorted scales. Tanaka's Meijuku dance troupe occupied the platform and the stage upon which it sat, with hands like claws and bodies crooked and contorted. The 12 dancers were creeping and crawling and slowly collapsing. It wasn't that the choreography was posed against that of Nijinsky. Its point of reference came from elsewhere. It was an exercising of something at once fertile and foreign in the bodies of the dancers, that activated this theatre afresh. In a letter to his troupe, Tanaka notes, quote, "Whenever I encounter the unexplicable antibody within your bodies, I renew my wish that you approach more and more the avant-garde," end quote. And what could be more avant-garde than a Japanese Buto dancer resurrecting a riotous Russian ballet, skulking to the sounds of machines, and quivering upon the levered platform of a North American sculptor in a neo-Baroque theatre in Paris in October of 1990. In Tanaka's Rite of Spring, the score, the dance, the set, and the theatre plunge into a type of communication, but not necessarily one that settles into an identifiable code. This plunge was heralded by the thump of a proscenium angel hitting a stage with the type of thud that only a body, but not necessarily a human body, might make. The sound was a type of pretext for what was to come, or more like a mark of punctuation that preempts the undoing of a theatre into which we had, minutes earlier, settled. This was an angel in the body of a theatre, sacrificed in the formation of a new world, a productive antibody in the body. It is little wonder that such events attract those fascinated by the intermingling of intensities in the generation of the new, the novel. The author, Marcel Proust, attended the opening performance of Stravinsky's Sacre de Printemps. The psychoanalyst, Félix Guattari, attended and spoke at the 4th and final performance of Tanaka's Rite of Spring. Intensive voyagers. In Anti-Oedipus, When Guattari and his collaborator Gilles Deleuze come to describe the constellation of contexts that exhaust themselves in creating what they call a new land, they turn to Proust. Or more specifically, they turn to In Search of Lost Time and what they refer to as the narrator spider. They describe this narrator as one who, quote, never ceases undoing webs and planes, resuming the journey, watching for the signs or the indices that operate like machines that will cause him to go on further, end quote. This is an image of an artist who lies poised at the centre of a web of their own making that reaches out into the world. It is not observation, nor description, nor any will to totalize that is the aim of the narrator spider. Rather, they are a sensor or a probe head to vibrations beyond that pass through, affect, rupture thoughts, and produce connections that continue the elaboration of the web and take the artist out further in a voyage of a kind. Guattari and Deleuze write of Proust, quote, he goes toward these new regions where the conjunctions are always partial and non-personal. The connections are always partial and non-personal. The conjunctions nomadic and polyvocal, the disjunctions included, where homosexuality and heterosexuality cannot be distinguished any longer. The world of transverse communications, where the finally conquered non-human sex mingles with the flowers. A new earth, where desire functions according to its molecular movements in extension, it becomes immobile, in a room and on a body without organs, an intensive voyage that undoes all the lands for the benefit of the one it is creating. And it's this key image that I'll fixate upon, or be fixating upon. This voyage to a new land involves movements in extension, but is not itself extensive. That is, such a journey is not made in movements from A to B, but rather in movements that traverse both A and B as a moment in the gossamer web through a dynamic glossalic cosmos. And Guattari and Deleuze suggest such a journey may be undertaken in a room. I imagine a theatre for an immobile dancer, a bedroom for a bedridden author, an apartment for a housebound philosopher. This image of an intensity tightly configured, indeed architecturally configured, that nevertheless is intimately bound to the forces and fluxes of the otherwise and elsewhere, is alluring. It's an image repeated across the oeuvre of Guattari and that of Deleuze, and in the collaborations of the two, where figures such as the strange contraption, the blinkered horse, the suprasexuality of primed plateaus, the cosmic egg and artisan, the crystal, the lobster, the masochist suspended in space and time, the fish whose movement is arrested in folds of Baroque marble, and the enfolding intensities of orchids, wasps, bees, and flies proliferate. These are images of discernible elements that are in concert with, configured with, and by the otherwise and elsewhere. It is also the image of the Butoh dancer, quote, at the intersection of all the scenes of the possible, end quote, as Guattari wrote of Tanaka. In these images, we encounter a type of holding tight of something in and of itself, particular and specific, that harnesses and is harnessed to the joyous forces beyond of which it is a part, a highly poised and sensitive part. For me, it is also an image that is intensely architectural, and not just because it might be configured architecturally in a room. It is also architectural in the sense that there is at the very birth of architecture such an intensive voyage. The first, albeit mythological architect, Theodolos, was known as the sculptor to have pioneered the capture of intensities. He was the first to produce animate statues of bodies in motion. Prior to Theodolos, sculptures of figures were set still. And what's meant by that is that prior to Theodolos, so the story goes, and it is story, figures, sculptors would construct bodies as in a still sort of state, not in sort of not as if they were in motion. It was the architect who captures an intensity in immobility, a force in matter which propels a figure, even when that propulsion is arrested. The Greek rhetorician Philostratus the Elder reports, quote, Before the time of Theodolos, the art of making statues had not yet conceived such a thing, end quote. Theodolos was famous for sculpture, and antiquity also records 4 architectural and design works. Theodolos designed a field upon which Aphrodite danced, then a cow machine, which allowed the queen of Knossos, Pasiphae, to consummate her love for a bull. That sort of sounds unlikely, but effectively Pasiphae was entranced and fell in love with a great bull and then needed to consummate that love. So she goes to an architect to actually construct the machine that would allow her to deposit herself within it in order to seduce the bull. When Asterion, the Minotaur, was conceived, Theodolos was again contracted, this time by the queen's husband, Minos. You can sort of also imagine Minos' shock at the birth. It would have been a bit of a surprise. This time, Theodolos was contracted to construct a labyrinth to control and contain the Minotaur, the monstrous offspring of architecture and the libido. And then finally, Theodolos was known as the designer of wings, which allowed himself and his son Icarus to escape a prison, to soar, much like 2 angels, until one went too close to the sun and fell. Exit stage left. The first architectures were, it turns out, concerned with stages for dance and wondrous machines that allowed bodies and libidos to escape the norms to which they had been accustomed. In quite a literal way, there is thus at the birth of architecture an intensive voyage through, quote, the world of transverse communications, where non-human sex mingles with the flowers. In this talk, I wish to trace a rather poised line of thought that travels largely via Guattari into Anti-Oedipus and soars through the machinic unconscious of 1979, and then swoons to the techno-fetishism and machinic eros of Japan in the 1980s. It is perhaps here that the non-human sex of architecture thoroughly blossoms. To do so, I will scuttle, and definitely not in slow motion, about 3 concepts that come to be something like the preconditions or the pretexts of an intensive voyage. The first is transverse communications, the second, non-human sex, and the third is extension and immobility, or otherwise what it is to voyage in a room. Transverse communications. In the work of Guattari, the term transversal describes a movement that complicates what might habitually have been thought of in terms of transference. It was the topic of a report Guattari delivered to the International Psychodrama Congress in Paris in 1964. The report would be published in the Revue de Psychothérapie Institutionnelle of 1965, and then in his book Psychoanalyse et transversalité of 1972. The report would come to be simply titled Transversality. For Guattari, transversality would account for the psyche of individuals as constructed in concert with a constellation of contexts. Indeed, it was Roy who would describe it as a transferential constellation. Yeah. It is the breadth and plurality of external contexts and the mobilities involved that would set transversality in opposition to the Freudian concept of transference. And I know I'm talking to a knowing crowd, but I'm going to explain this anyway, just in case. For Sigmund Freud, transference was the process whereby feelings associated with a figure, one figure A, are redirected to another B. This was the oft problematic transference of feelings from mothers and fathers onto authority figures, or what Freud called surrogates, that come to stand in place of the Oedipal relation, daddy, mummy, and me. Transversality comes to operate as a way of problematizing such relations in 2 key manners. First, it makes terms proximate that were habitually designated to different realms, connecting terms that were previously thought to barely relate one to another, or that existed in opposition. It is transversality that is in operation when Guattari speaks of a machinic unconscious, machinic eros, ethico-aesthetics, or that occurs in the portmanteau of ethos Sophie, or where Deleuze and Guattari come to speak of the narrator spider. And it is transversality that allows us now to write of capitalism and schizophrenia without using an Oxford comma. transversality is a traversing of different regimes of thought that does not see one as an origin and the other as a destination, and does not seek to repress one within the other, as in the presence of anti-production within production itself. In Anti-Oedipus, Guattari and Deleuze parenthetically give the example of transversals, quote, transversals between the two, since social symbolism can become sexual material and sexuality a ritual of social aggregation, end quote. This is the transversality of two terms habitually relegated to different realms, the social and sex, placing what Michel Foucault refers to in the preface to Anti-Oedipus as Marx and Freud in the same incandescent light, end quote. There is in transversality a making proximate of terms that are habitually relegated to alternate regions or incompossible regimes of thought. Second, transversality operates by affirming that which voyages. It prioritizes or privileges that which travels through structural demarcations, habitual organizations, or the terms of any dualism. In geometry, the word transversal tends to refer to a line which cuts through two planes. Often the planes that are transversed are parallel and have no point of concurrence. That is, they operate like two sides of a wall, running alongside one another without ever really meeting. The transversal line cuts through these two parallel planes like a crack or a peephole or a glory hole through a wall. Whilst in geometry a transversal might be abstract and defined by the two planes it passes through, in the work of Guattari and his collaborator Deleuze, all that is abstract tends to be operative, and the transversal takes precedence. What is affirmed in transversality is that which voyages between. Proust's narrator Spider is helpful in suggesting to Guattari and Deleuze examples of transversality, and is leveraged again in clarifying the idea of transverse communications. The question here is, how is it that different elements communicate? They explore a moment in Proust where, quote, everything comes apart, but this time in a molecular and pure multiplicity, where the partial objects, the boxes, the vessels, all have their positive determinations and enter into aberrant communication, following a transversal that runs through the whole work, end quote. I imagine the term positive determinations is to suggest that these objects, partial objects, boxes and vessels, are something in and of themselves, determinable, discernible. In the machinic unconscious, Guattari refers to such a determination as a fusional feeling, a type of holding together, and poses it alongside, quote, a feeling of cartographic hyperlucidity, which presides on the contrary over the location of transversal itineraries, end quote. That is to say, that though something may be in and of itself, it is also partial to that which runs through it, and by which it is constructed in communication. The transversal does not generate or reinforce the identity of the elements it passes between. The elements the transversal gives access to and that it moves between are complicated, cut, curtained, frayed, inextricable, and partial. The transversal is thus the voyage between indistinct entities that are formed in the very wake of the movement. Or, to put this back into Guattari's parlance, which always comes at the risk of further complication, quote, assemblages of enunciation produce modes of disindividuated transversalist subjectification, end quote. And here I'll attempt an explanation which may also be, regrettably, a simplification. It is not that communication runs from one to another, from a speaker A to a listener B, for example. It is that communication constructs one as a speaker or a listener in that instant, in that place, in that phrase, albeit as a disindividuated transversalist subject. Our engagements with others, other people, other animals, other spaces, are always a constant parcelling and an oblique and tangential sliding and suspension, attunements and affinities, glances and gestures, rather than an unadulterated or unsullied or direct communication. The theatre tells us to quieten down by the rise of a curtain and the dimming of lights, neither of which make the passive-aggressive shh sound of the person sitting behind us, but each of which heralds a moment where an alternate communication system is being initiated. And in the theatre, we tend to sit alongside the objects of our obsession. I take a lover to a theatre to be with him or her or them, and yet we don't look at each other, but rather share a view outward. And one form of communication, one mode of love is suspended, shh, as another is enacted. And this happens as we sit intensely immobile, in a seat, in a box, in a theatre that is itself immobile in a street and in a city. Sorry, I went too far. When Guattari and Deleuze turn to the transversality of communications, they don't refer to the whispers of curtains or the coercion of dimming lights. They refer instead to the aberrant communication between sexes, noting that the sexes communicate, quote, in a transverse mode, where each subject possesses both of them, but with the two of them partitioned off, and where each subject communicates with one sex or the other in another subject, end quote. In ourselves are all, and in each we recognize the other as bodies within bodies configured in the act of communication itself. Enunciation produces, as Guattari said. Non-human sex. When Guattari and Deleuze speak of an intensive voyage to, quote, the world of transverse communications, where the finally conquered non-human sex mingles with the flowers, end quote, they are looking to a zone where events are no longer pre-programmed by axiomatic frames, the axiomatic frames in which they are habitually coded, configured, indeed prefigured. Oedipal theory and its prefiguring of desire is the key focus. Another associated prefiguring is what the psychoanalyst and philosopher call the anthropomorphic representation of sex, often in italics and punctuated with an exclamation mark. They thrust into an odd intermingling, sex as in sexuality, and sex as in gender, and sex as in sexual expression, also genre. It's odd in the sense that so much discourse, so much contemporary discourse, is framed about the differentiations of these terms. But it's not particularly odd, I would argue, in the context of a work where so many terms that are habitually framed or differentiated dance together in transversality. We are told in Anti-Oedipus that the concept of non-human sex comes from Karl Marx, and why not? If social symbolism can become a sexual material and sexuality a ritual of social aggregation, then Freud is a political theorist and Marx a therapist, charting the territories of sex, sexuality, gender and genre, but also its deterritorializations. Guattari and Deleuze note that for Marx, quote, the true difference is not the difference between the two sexes, but the difference between the human sex and the non-human sex, end quote. Guattari and Deleuze reference Marx's early critique of Hegel's philosophy of right of 1843, and this particular footnote in Anti-Oedipus also directs the reader's attention to what Guattari and Deleuze call a fine commentary on the concept by François Lyotard. First to Marx. Marx turns to the theatre in his critique, and he does so to explain the fault of Hegel's dialectical method. He invokes the character of Snug from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Snug was a joiner and one of the so-called mechanicals, hired to perform in a play drawn from Ovid's Metamorphoses Pyramus and Thisbe. This would thus be a play within a play. The story of Pyramus and Thisbe is of two lovers separated by a wall who communicate through a crack and only come together not in consummation but in the consumption of a lion. Snug was hired to play the part of the ravenous lion, but in order not to raise fear in the audience, Snug would make it clear that he was not really a lion. Marx paraphrases Shakespeare. Indeed, Marx very badly paraphrases Shakespeare. Marx writes, quote, "I am the lion, and I am not the lion, but Snug," end quote. Coding this via Hegel's dialectic would suggest the thesis, "I am a lion," and the antithesis, "I am not a lion," generate a higher truth in synthesis, "I am Snug." But for Marx, this is problematic because the terms are interchangeable. That is, the thesis and antithesis here might just as easily be, "I am a lion, I am Snug," and in synthesis, "I am not a lion." And Marx notes that, quote, "Here, each extreme is sometimes the line of opposition and sometimes the snug of mediation," end quote. Marx's critique of Hegel is thus at once a critique and creative work. The critique is simple enough, a critique on the grounds that Hegel's method reduces the particularities of any event or idea, such as the idea of gender, to a subset or a predicate of an absolute idea, swallowing particularity into generality, or what Deleuze and Guattari, or Guattari and Deleuze might call a statistical set. The danger of this is that empirical entities, existence, come to be used merely as illustrations of encompassing abstract ideas, essences. For Marx, when we look closely, terms so often posed as opposites have, quote, "nothing in common," and, quote, "neither need nor complement one another," end quote. Marx questions the principle of les extrêmes se touchent, the idea that extremes, opposites themselves meet, touch, attract. The poles of the earth, the north and south, and two of many genders, male and female, are engaged by Marx as examples of elements treated as opposites, which in analysis are not different beings, but rather for Marx, differentiations of a single being. For Marx, Hegelian logic confuses the difference within a category essence with the, quote, "actual opposition of mutually exclusive essence," end quote. The point is that when one speaks of a north and a south pole as opposites, they are only opposites predicated in the frame of the revolving planet itself. And it is this framing that generates the opposites itself. Similarly, for Marx, quote, "both female and male gender are of one species, and thus not real opposites at all." Quote, "Truly real extremes would be pole and non-pole, human and non-human gender. Difference here is one of existence," end quote. It is Marx's phrase, "non-human gender, unmenschlich Geschlecht," that becomes in Lyotard's Discours figure of 1971 and Anti-Oedipus of a year later, not non-human gender, le genre non-humain, but instead non-human sex, le sexe non-humain, in a move that perhaps makes what Lyotard refers to as Marx's, quote, "radical critical observation," end quote, and what Guattari and Deleuze characterize as Marx's, they call it very mysterious, concept, even more radical, critical, and mysterious. The core creative argument Marx is making in his extended paper is that a close analysis of any thing or event would lead to different conclusions to those generated by placing the empirical entities within a Hegelian frame of opposites in synthesis. And this is not a mild washing away of the extremes in order to occupy a bland between or a mush of liminality, but rather the negotiation of intensity. When terms have nothing in common and neither need or complement one another, then they might better be thought of as differences in and of themselves and explored in intensity as a curling in on oneself, as plays within plays, as lovers within lines, within paraphrased and badly paraphrased lines, as single intense walls of which Pyramus and Thisbe are but faces thereof, as poised and primed plateau, as societies lusting for revolution, as cracking walls and architectures on the verge of spilling entire cities from a room. Which brings us to Lyotard. In a chapter of Discours Figure dedicated to opposition and difference, Lyotard turned to Marx's critique. Lyotard notes that artists are not operating between two spaces of the world and subject, or between discourse and figure, but rather operate in what he calls desire's own space. Such a space disavows text and the ego, and is where truth might be encountered, quote, in its unruliness as an event, end quote. And such a space presents itself as unexpected, entirely out of place, disordering and free-floating. For Lyotard, quote, the slip of the tongue or the orgasm, end quote, are examples of desire's own space. The relationship between figurations, codings and classifications of language and the slip of tongues, the event of lived actualities, is for Lyotard, quote, the relation of two states, heterogeneous yet adjoining in an irreversible anachrony, end quote. And here again we have an image of the tightly configured, indeed architecturally configured, that nevertheless is intimately bound to the otherwise and elsewhere. Marx's notion of non-human sex is invoked to make the point. Lyotard laments the idea that, quote, from one of the sexes the other can be thought engendered through a simple eidetic variation consisting in a nullification that reveals the resulting term's complementary nature with the initial term, end quote. And notes the alignment of this idea of a complementary nature with discourses of attraction, les extrêmes se touchent. For Lyotard, this is to generate a mythical dialectic of totality, a religious complementarity, an Adam for an Eve, a Pyramus for a Thisbe. But he goes further and suggests, quote, on the other stage, the sexes are not complementary at all. Sorry, are not complementary, end quote, and not singular at all. That is, there is no one sexuality into which others might sit, like poles in a gravitational field. Lyotard concludes that, quote, the no of non-human, inhuman sex indicates difference, another position, stage, that unseats that of consciousness, that of discourse and reality, end quote. And what we start getting is a sort of play in a type of difference that is outside the habitual sort of set of subject-subjectification. Now back to Deleuze and Guattari. When it comes to the extension of difference, or the radical unseating and fleeing of any Freudian theatre, Guattari and Deleuze aren't waiting for a curtain to fall. They paraphrase Lyotard, who paraphrases Marx, who badly paraphrases Shakespeare, in describing the molar formations of sex. Quote, they must not be opposed determinations of a same entity, nor the differentiations of a single being, such as the masculine and the feminine in human sex, but different or really distinct things, distinct beings as found in the dispersions of non-human sex, the clover and the bee, end quote. And though the sexes constitute really distinct things, sex as in sexuality and sex as in gender, and sex as in sexual expression, also genre, fail to distinct themselves. Or at least they fail to distinct themselves as nouns, as essentialized identities, or as subject-producing signifiers. Where sex, as in sexuality, and sex as in gender, and sex as in sexual expression, also genre, become really distinct things is as verbs in acts, in the performances and playing out. And this is not merely a placing of qualities into more fine-grained but still molar statistical sets. The psychoanalyst and the philosopher note, quote, making love is not just becoming as one or even two, but becoming as 100,000. desiring machines, or the non-human sex, not one or even two sexes, but n sexes, to each its own sexes, end quote. Indeed, Guattari, at the time of the publication of, shortly after the publication of Anti-Oedipus, ups the ante in a contribution to an edition of Revue Recherche titled 3 Billion Perverts, and in a lecture given at Columbia University a few years later in noting, quote, human beings make love with signs of all kinds of extra-human elements, things, animals, images, looks, machines, and so on, end quote. The first, albeit mythological architect, Theodolos, would have concurred. What is suggested here is an image of a subject, for want of a better word, that is something particular, specific, and n-intensive, which is configured in acts and in concert with a multiplicitous otherwise and elsewhere, the no of the non-human. This is not a mummy, daddy, me, or from A to B, or a this to that subject, but rather a mummy, daddy, bee, clover, angel falling, theatre flowering, architect flying, genre producing, social screaming, streets dreaming, neo-baroquing, wall poking, lion plunging, stone scuttling, spider sucking subject. The subject as a voyager in intensity. But a voyager in a room. In 1981, a machine fell from the drawing board of an architect, hitting the street with a guttural thump. This machine was the work of the architect Shin Takamatsu, and it would be christened Origin. It was the first of many machines that would fall into Kyoto and occasionally beyond. Takamatsu produced many types of building, dance halls, kimono production houses, Buddhist temples, geisha lodgings, okiya, and dental offices, but none of which are recognizable as such. Indeed, none of which are particularly recognizable as buildings. They are barely buildings, barely functional, and more machine than architecture. They sit throughout the city like fertile and foreign manga to alien technologies. I can imagine circumstance in which Takamatsu's contractions might whir, vibrate, pump and grind into action, but for now this movement is arrested, suspended, and though they don't move in extensity, they hit the street with such force that all Kyoto shook. When Guattari turns to the odd architectural machines of Takamatsu in the 80s, their poised immobile intensity reminds him, quote, of the position of a Buto dancer, like Min Tanaka, who completely folds in on his body and remains nevertheless hypersensitive to every perception emanating from the environment, end quote. And thus, to our list of intensive voyages, Cruz and Tanaka, Guattari adds a third, the machines of Takamatsu. As voyages in intensity, Takamatsu's machines offer Guattari something that Proust's narrator Spider and Tanaka's antibody bodies do not. They offer flight from a personological, anthropomorphic, anthropocentric prison. In a footnote to the machinic unconscious, Guattari suggests, quote, in order to be delivered from the personological polarities of communication, we must refuse to be imprisoned by the hypothesis of a self-enclosed, signifying unconscious subjectivity, end quote. This is to say, as Guattari and Deleuze did in Anti-Oedipus, one must be wary that the intensive voyage does not, quote, reconstitute the lands, only too well known, end quote. Guattari heeds this warning in turning from the personological, the human, toward the subjectivity of cities and architectures. He journeyed to Japan over many years for the purposes of exploring the techno-fetishism and machinic eros of cities, Tokyo and beyond, and the immobile intensities of a new wave of Japanese architecture. In this architecture, Guattari locates forms of expression unbound to doxa, humanist fixations, and the stylistic overtures, also genres that were habitual preoccupations. He finds instead what he refers to as, quote, a resurgence of a will to singularization, end quote. the proliferation of architectural movements which have nothing in common, and buildings which neither need nor complement one another. In Japan at the time, the motto of architecture schools seemed to be not one or even two architectures, but n architectures, to each its own genre. In his paper, The Architectural Machines of Shin Takamatsu, which was to be published in 1994, Guattari draws on the account of the historian and theorist of Japanese architecture, Boton Bogner, to name some of the singular trajectories of the new wave of architecture. He notes a becoming child of architecture, a becoming vegetal, a becoming animal, becoming abstract, a becoming nirvana, a becoming non-object, and of the work of the architect Takamatsu, a becoming machine, and what would be less personological than a machine? In his paper on Takamatsu, Guattari notes that architects tended to play between the object as a really distinct thing and context, the streets, cities, and conceptual constellations in which architecture finds itself. For Guattari, this relation operates on a sliding scale between two poles. On the one hand, an architecture that is a type of obstinate object, I think Guattari uses the word structural object, and on the other, an architecture swept away in the elsewhere and otherwise. Guattari isn't particularly interested in either pole necessarily, but rather what he frames as, quote, a third position in which the work is both complete as an aesthetic object and totally open to its context, end quote. To the Hegelian thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the yes, no, yes, Guattari offers a thesis-thesis synthesis, the yes, yes, yes of orgasm or the slip of the tongue. And for Guattari, it is the strange contraptions of the Kyoto-based architect Takamatsu that best negotiates this seductive third position. Takamatsu's first work, Origin, is first chronologically, but also in the sense of distinguishing a genre of machines to come, or more like a mark of punctuation that preempts the undoing of a city into which populations had over centuries settled. This becoming machine of architecture was designed for Akihiko Izakura, the head of a 300-year-old obi-making company that claims to use 2,000-year-old dyeing processes. An obi is a traditional sash, a long piece of fabric. It's just under 4 meters long and about 25 centimeters wide. It is spun from the thread of silkworms and comes to be carefully folded about a kimono that is itself folded about a body. The obi is an image for the tightly configured. It generates a poise to the folds of the kimono and the body enwrapped, operating as a decorative belt and a bow of a kind that completes the parceling of a body bound in long histories, long threads, long cultures of sexuality, gender, and sexual expression and genre. Origin would be a house for the obi, but would not function to house the processes of obi production. And indeed, it tended not to function at all. Quote, just make it what you want. You worry about the design, I'll worry about how to use it, end quote, Izakura told Takamatsu. I think this is sort of a dream for all architects, just to be told, don't worry about what we'll use it for, you just make something. When Corbusier had described a house as a machine for living, it was the molar functionality of the machine that mattered. But Takamatsu's machines respond to far more in not responding to modernist habits. Its point of reference comes from elsewhere. The obi is one partial connection for this building, and others are noted. Takamatsu suggests that origin is like a Shinto shrine, in that it, quote, is not something that really caters to human beings, because in a sense it has no function, end quote. When Guattari suggests that Takamatsu's machines are, quote, hypersensitive to every perception emanating from the environment, end quote, it's not that his architecture seamlessly inserts itself into a city, but rather that the architecture responds to a context in a particular way, its own way, in an act, in a performance, in a playing out. Indeed, Gilles was speaking of a type of comportment that's sort of essential, and I think the architecture has itself a type of comportment. Takamatsu himself notes two methods by which a building might fall onto a street in a city such as Kyoto. And the method he gets to is indeed important, I think, for us when we think about a type of politics of the city, but also a politics of selves and the way in which we insert ourselves into systems, situations, the state of things, the habit of things, in a way. Not just how we insert ourselves and what statements we make, but actually how those statements resist something like co-option into the system itself. Takamatsu says, quote, "Imagine the city to be a length of obi," end quote. And he writes, quote, "If you wish to add or repair the obi, you could weave a new pattern into it using a very similar thread and stitch. This would then become indistinguishable from what was existing. The second method would be to inlay a brilliant and complex knot of golden thread into the obi to transform it. This is my method," Takamatsu says. "Kyoto has a profound tranquility which rapidly assimilates all new intrusions. It is a form of stagnation. The context here is something that must be played with, challenged, fought, and transfigured. In creating a new building, it is necessary to also create a new place, to redefine the surroundings," end quote. This is the generation of a new earth of the kind. The architectural machines of Takamatsu enter into aberrant communications with the city. And because a place such as Kyoto can easily swallow new intrusions, the architecture had to bite from within, be a knot in an otherwise smooth fabric, be gold in an elsewhere silk thread. Origin would be an exercising of something at once germinal and foreign in the city. For Takamatsu, it had to be a machine lest it merely be another building, just another building in just another city. And as a machine, it is identifiable as an object, solid, symmetrical, and assembled of components, distinct parts with their own positive determinations, parts that key one into another, pistons within shafts and plugs within drains and rivets within metal surfaces. This is not a machine that produces a product, though. Origin has no function. It is a machine that produces pleasure, a type of voluptuousness, the throb of a full volume. It's of smooth planes and rounded orifices, of surfaces that fold and flare like an orchid that a skilled alien metalworker might have forged. It is a locomotive with train couplings and connections, but a locomotive suspended on a street. It is a sex aid, a pumping object, an orifice poised for pleasure, but at rest in a city-sized bedside cabinet. Indeed, it's hard to imagine anything less mobile and more intense, a volume as voluptas. Associations are easy to suggest, but none of the associations are a perfect fit, and this is perhaps why such an architecture remains unassimilated, whilst being partial to and part of its world. That is to say, such a machine is in a communication with the city, but it's a particularly aberrant communication, a slipping architectural tongue. To this end, the outcome and effect of Takamatsu's machines are neither total nor foreseen, and are not even of his making. These machines are pulsional, as Lyotard might say, strange contraptions, as Guattari might say, with a sex of their own. Takamatsu might draw them, but after that they hit a street with their own desires. Quote, "The machine desires," end quote, the architect writes. The conclusion is a simple one. Just because architecture doesn't have sex like we do, does not mean that it doesn't. This poised intensity is the machinic eros of architecture, and in this regard, Takamatsu is the heir of Deleuze. In conclusion, Takamatsu's machines are to subjectivity as an angel is to a theatre or a bee to an orchid, an extension and dispersal of that which is far too often relegated to an interior, an all too human interior. Takamatsu's machines are an architecture that, quote, undoes all the lands for the benefit of the one it is creating, end quote, as Guattari and Deleuze wrote of the work of the narrator Spider. Indeed, we commence with an idea of the artist, architecturally configured, poised at the centre of a web of its own making, a voyager in intensity, immobile in a room. But the same can be said of other things with subjectivity, including rooms themselves, buildings and cities. Or at least those rooms, buildings and cities that become really distinct things in verbs, in acts, in the performances and playing out, even when such acts are arrested. Of the machines of Takamatsu, Guattari notes, quote, "The objective remains the same in each case, to arrive at a point where the building becomes a non-human subject, capable of connecting with segments of individual and collective human subjectivities." End quote. And this is not about personification or the imposition of an anthropological or anthropocentric onto the machine, because Guattari goes on to note that the outcome here is not the becoming human of the machine, but rather the, quote, "becoming machine of subjectivity," end quote, itself. It is the non-human here, the non-familiar that is operative, and it sometimes takes an antibody to elaborate a body, an inanimate to enliven the animate, a machine to communicate subjectivity, and a non-human sex, perhaps the non-human sex of architecture, to make love with the world. Thank you.